Hi, it's Dave. Welcome. Today we're joined with James Douma for our third episode this week. And today we're going to be talking about Tesla's competition in full self-driving. Who is the competition? But more so like in 5 or 10 years, are there any competitive players who can really go neck to neck with Tesla or even perhaps to even have the chance to beat Tesla? Anyways, James, welcome to the show again.
Great. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So
So this seems like a good thing to do as kind of an actual conversation as opposed to an interview, because I know that you have some interesting insights on this one too. But you've been thinking about Tesla's as a competitive entity in a field of a bunch of other players.
yeah,
And from the tech side, like I can talk about, what you can do on tech and stuff, but a lot of the questions about who the competition is and whatnot, they actually revolve around these business issues, right?
that's true. Yeah. I think going forward for Tesla, if autonomous driving and full self-driving and robotaxi is going to be an increasingly bigger part of their business, it's important to understand kind of the competitive landscape. What kind of competitive advantage does Tesla have? Can they maintain that advantage? What does the future look like? Is it a winner takes most market where, let's say, hypothetically, Tesla is taking most, or is it more of a distributed market where there are several major players? How do you look at this? Like in 5 or 10 years, do you think there's going to be competition in a sense where it's not just Tesla at top and then, a few other players, trying to vie for second or third place, but do you think there could be legitimate competition in terms of, other players, and who would these players be who could perhaps go neck to neck with Tesla in full self-driving?
Well, so Waymo already has a service, right? Out there, they're driving people around. It seems like they'll be relatively successful in that space. I mean, it's working. They're driving people around. It's not. We don't know how it's going to scale yet. That remains to be seen. They have ambitions to scale. It's not unreasonable that they could scale. It's probably, there are probably limits to how fast that they can scale. I think when they have this core limit in terms of how many vehicles they can make and how quickly they can. But an interesting place to kind of start the discussion on this, let's call it a discussion, is what does competition mean in this space? Because one of my senses of this is that the addressable market, the kind of immediately addressable market, because this isn't a technology where you're going to have to convince people to use it. Ride sharing kind of already exists and it's established in a bunch of places. And so, like if you had robot taxis and they're kind of a drop-in replacement for a human-driven taxi in a lot of things. And that market seems pretty big. Like I went looking for numbers, and there are, hundreds of thousands of taxis and hundreds of thousands of rideshare vehicles in the United States. So when I think about that as the size of the market, like to a first approximation, if robotaxis cost about the same and they provide about the same service, then they should be cheaper to operate, right? Because you get the driver out of them. The driver's a major cost of both taxis and rideshare. Then you would think that until you get to around, 500,000 units out there in the field, something like that, that there doesn't have to be direct competition, right? That is, if Waymo's got limits to how fast it can scale, and I would suggest that it'll take a long time to make hundreds of thousands of vehicles and for them to map a bunch of cities and do that. So there's a big window of time for all that stuff to occur. That anybody, Cruise, they can just pick different cities than Waymo's in, right? I mean, my first sort of response to thinking about competition is that all of these players can expand for a long time before they have to go head to head. Where, now a place that could be wrong is if there are, for whatever reasons, certain markets that are especially good for robotaxis. And so I thought about that some, and there are some environments that are especially hard to drive in, say, right? And so you could see them maybe initially not being good candidates for robotaxis. But the rest of, the Chandler, Arizona, the United States has huge numbers of Chandler, Arizonas out there, right? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I had this thought this morning or yesterday that I think the addressable market for full self-driving is like so much bigger than what people realize right now. Because if you think about what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years, think about India, for example. I mean, this is a massive, billion plus, population country that's going to be, making leaps and bounds economically, which will mean transportation as well. And we're talking about such a it's such a big market that isn't really part of a big part of the transportation market right now. And so when we look at 10 or 20 years down the road, we're going to have these, as different parts of the world get more industrialized, you have a bigger, increased, larger middle class, upward mobility. Technology is enabling that. You even have Starlink is going to be enabling probably a lot of economic development from even rural areas. But you've got a lot of trends over the next 10 or 20 years that are going to lead to economic development, which are going to make the addressable market for ride sharing or robotaxi or even full self-driving like humongous. I mean, we're talking, and that's on a bigger picture note. That's where I'm thinking like, yeah, we think that a trillion or $2 trillion market cap for a company is huge right now. But, back 10 or 20 years ago, a few $100 billion was a huge market cap company, right? With Cisco or something. But now it's like a few trillion, but in 10 or 20 years, it's going to be much bigger because you have a much bigger market, right? A lot of more serviceable people, more money also with a lot of people. So I think go ahead.
When you bring that up, I notice occasionally I'll do these spreadsheets and I'm like, oh, $10 trillion valuation. That's like nuts, right?
Yeah.
And you think about okay, well, the math says it should be 10 trillion. So when you made your comment about valuation, I wanted to ask the question, do you find yourself doing this? Well, companies will get bigger, kind of thing, like, yeah, that valuation seems unreasonable, but I mean, once upon a time, we thought $1 trillion was really big, right?
Yeah. I mean, for a long time, I was kind of resistant to kind of just being too exuberant with, future valuations, because I'm kind of, I have this contrarian thing also where it's like if the stock price and everyone's expectations are just going to the moon, I'm a little bit, let's hold off a bit. Let's look at this more rationally. But I actually, having some consolidation with Tesla actually helps, because I'm like, okay, what is objectively, apart from our emotions, like what's going to happen 10 or 20 years down the road? And yeah, the world's going to get so much bigger. I think the largest companies in the world will have larger market caps, probably much larger. So we're going to probably have $10 trillion. If Amazon is, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, and in 15 years, they're just expanding, through the world. I mean, one thing is interesting is when I look at a lot of the companies, I did this thing where I looked at social media penetration in all of the industrialized nations. And it's surprisingly how much like Google and Facebook with, Instagram, WhatsApp, and all the properties, YouTube, how much they have dominated the top 5 social media places in almost every single country in the world, right? Except for maybe certain countries like China or,
China and Russia.
some certain close countries. But surprisingly, most of the world is really open in that sense. And it's like you can't bet against the whole world, gaining in economic prosperity and development, and certain companies who are in that pole position growing in value with more revenue. And so, yeah, I don't think in 10 years or 15 years, $10 trillion company, it seems, like I think it's definitely probably likely actually. And then if you like, what are the criteria for a $10 trillion company to happen? A large part of it is the market size. Without the market for people to pay for your product, and for a lot of people to pay for it, you can't get that type of market cap valuation. And so what's interesting about full self-driving is and transportation, also energy storage, is it's such a big market where everyone is driving every day, you know, and there's some value that everyone is paying gas money and a car payment or something. They see that value already. It's historical proven value. And so, but that's just with a dumb car, you know, that's with a car that they have to drive themselves. We're talking about a completely different use case for a car, which is this is now a smart car that can drive you, take over the responsibility of driving that you had before. So it's a different use case. Sure, you go from point A to B, but before you had to take responsibility, you had to waste an hour of your time, you know, getting to work and back. But now someone else or something else drives you in a smart way. And that I think is it's interesting because it's a completely new use case and it's saving you that much time, you know, and let's say an hour a day of commute time that you could use for other things. So how do you quantify that? How do you value that? You know, and I think
that one's tough. Yeah.
Yeah. I think
there's a different one, which is pretty common, where people just basically say, you know, typically the addressable market for something goes the unit addressable market goes up when the cost to the consumer goes down, right? And so that's an easier way to think about things. And I've tended to go that way because there's pretty straightforward curves in that one. But talking about the additional value, the additional use cases and what's that worth and how will people use it, that's really, it's back to the iPhone thing that we talked about before, you know, where, you know, you could look at that, like there aren't things we use the iPhone for today that you couldn't have imagined, you know, when with the first phone, right? And yet somehow we didn't, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's also like people were shocked that, you know, people would spend $600 or $700 on a phone, right? Back in 2007 with the iPhone, but now it's like $600 or $700 is commonplace, right? I mean, phones are much higher, but it's not just the phones; it's also apps too, right? What you're doing on the phone, people are spending a lot of money on apps or even games or services, etc., through the platform. It's amazing how much Apple is able to take from the ecosystem. Like I've been looking into this company called Roblox. It's a game for kids and others, but Apple takes 30% of all the revenue from that game. On that platform, when Apple, I don't know how much they really provide, you know, for Roblox. Like Roblox could, you know, do their own marketing, a lot of other stuff, payments, you know, etc. It's huge tax because Apple controls that platform. It controls the medium in which people use those products. You know, it's a gatekeeper in a sense. And in some ways, another way to also think about it is you're saving all this time inside the car, which it's almost a no-brainer for people to appreciate that. And then what you use with that time, now the car becomes a gatekeeper in a sense. I mean, you could sure have your phone and your iPad in the car doing stuff, but there's also like another angle where with full self-driving, if you can solve it in different ways, you become the gatekeeper in how people can order services from full self-driving. Meaning, if you want a pizza delivered to your house, it kind of makes sense if you control the logistics platform. You control all the transportation, when it gets to what place and how it gets and how much.
So when you talk about it that way, do you see Tesla having features in their car that allow them to maintain it? Because I mean, you could ask a question about like, why aren't there viable competitors to the iPhone? And I know there are Android phones and that kind of stuff, but the iPhone, it's definitely kind of got this thing that it owns, and it's doing a pretty good job of holding that space. And they're providing enough value as a platform that A, people pay $1,000 for the phone, and B, people are eager to get on there and pay the 30% Apple tax to use it as a medium for distribution. And so, I mean, they've got a strong enough lock on that thing, or they're providing enough value, right? Or that, like, because the ecosystem has got a ton of value, you know, without the iPhone, you know, in a sense, there's no app store and there's no, you know, these opportunities for creating like games and kind of stuff don't exist. So there's definitely value there. And you can talk about whether, you know, is Apple taking too much relative to what other creators do, but they definitely seem to have, at least strategically, managed to get a lock on that. And so that my question there is like, do you think it's feasible for Tesla to get that kind of lock on transportation services? Like, say they've got a Robotaxi and it's working great and it's out there, but then you've also got your Waymos and your Cruises, and maybe Mobileye comes out with something, and Aurora and 4 or 5 other startups. There's all these players in this space, right? But to be the one that basically can that's providing the differentiated experience that people will pay enough extra for. Like, we think of vehicles as a commodity. I mean, taxis are a commodity, and Lyft and Uber, the prices are the same, right? They're pretty clearly commoditized. Is there a good reason to believe that Tesla wouldn't get commoditized? Because I think there's kind of assumption that they will be.
Yeah, I started out like, if you were to ask me 6 months ago about full self-driving, I would have been more like, I think full self-driving will be commoditized eventually. But I'm actually revisiting that idea because I think the question lies is, like, let's say in the March of nines, if you go 99.99, whatever, 99%, safe, it's like, does each digit really matter that much as you go further and further out? And, if you would have asked me 6 months ago, I'd be like, well, at a certain point, it probably doesn't matter that much, the more you go out. But then recently I've been thinking about the idea of, what if it really does matter? What if it really does matter if you're just 1 decimal point further out in terms of accuracy, and always just 1 decimal point further out? Like, what if that actually has a profound impact on the perception of people's safety inside your vehicle?
Yeah. So I have two interesting, completely opposite sort of takes on this. Like, I worked at a company. I did some consulting for a company that made airbag crash sensors back when those things were new, right? And it turns out that if you make an airbag crash sensor that's twice as good, you cannot charge 1 penny more for it, right? And it's not like there's not a competitive market, because Mercedes and Ford and Volkswagen and Honda, they're all separate. They've all got their own kind of priorities. But this airbag company, they very quickly discovered that people only wanted like the lowest common denominator, like the thing that made it possible. And when I think about like people I know and whatnot, like, how many people would pay an extra $100 to have a better airbag in their car, right? I mean, say that was an option that you could get. How many people do you think would pay the extra 100 or 500 or whatever it was for? When I bought the first car that was for sale in the United States, they had anti-lock brakes, right? And you couldn't buy anti-lock brakes as like you had to buy it as part. It was Acura's initial Integra. I think it was like the 2nd or 3rd or 4th year that they made the Integra. That was the first car you could get anti-lock on that was not ridiculous in the US. And you had to buy the super top end version, and it was thousands and thousands of dollars and whatnot. And I can't imagine at that time, and in fact, it was the case that nobody bought that car, right, to get the anti-lock, even though anti-lock brakes arguably are a huge safety thing. So on the one hand, I have all this data that tells me, in my own personal experience, like, people won't pay for safety. Like, once you get to a particular point, they won't pay for safety. But then it occurs to me, there's this other really interesting kind of social phenomena, which is totally the opposite, right? So if you ask people, well, how safe is this jet airplane versus that jet airplane? And will you pay more for a ticket on the airplane that has the better flight record? And the airline industry's experience has generally been no, that doesn't happen, right? On the other hand, you get a couple of accidents on this 800 Max, and it's freaking grounded, and nobody will get on the plane, right? It's radioactive, right? And even after they get them back in the air because of all the press. So it seems like there's this that I mean, my takeaway, like, how do you reconcile these two things? Whereas on the one, because the thing is, airline fatalities are so rare. I mean, car fatalities are resilient. Like, if you had to choose between paying more to reduce your risk in an airline crash or more to reduce your risk in a car crash, that, like, there's no competition, right? I saw this great study a while back comparing, like, the risk. If you live more than 8 miles from an airport, the odds of you dying on the way to the airport are higher than the odds of you dying on the flight, right? Just driving 8 miles is more risk of dying than flying all the way across the United States or flying to Japan or whatnot, right? That's the difference. And yet, like, we don't make these rational choices, right? We make these choices in in a structure where we're hypersensitive to certain things, right? Like one airplane falls out, it's 100,000 flights a year worldwide. One airplane falls out of the sky, and now nobody will fly on that plane, right? On the other hand, airbags kill people every day. I mean, airbags save a lot more people than they kill, but bad airbags, they kill people. I mean, it happens. But we don't say, oh, I'm not going to take a Takama airbag sensor in my car. I'm going to buy that car because it's got a different airbag sensor, right? Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, there are these examples of where, people absolutely will pay for, or rather they will not pay if you don't have Sterling. Maybe that's the lesson, right? Like you have to have super good safety or people won't use your thing. But once you get to that level, maybe they won't pay you any premium to be any safer at all.
Yeah. I'm thinking there's another kind of caveat to that, or interesting factor, which is transparency of data. Like if data is completely transparent and you see the complete number of accidents, I think if it's a rare occurrence, then people can attribute it to a fluke, experience, whatever occurrence. But if you have thousands and thousands or millions of data points of accidents, etc., happening, just constantly, and it's transparent data, and you could see, it's not just one accident, in 12 months per se, but it's like an airline or something, but it's, millions of accidents. If you see the data across various, let's say autopilot or autonomous driving type of, packages, and you see the Tesla package, let's say out of every, million people driving a Tesla, they get into an accident. Let's say, there's 1,000 people that get into an accident per year or something. But then you have the next competitor, it's 10,000 people get into an accident per million people, hypothetically. In that case, it seems like maybe it would matter, if you have that data, like that obviously wouldn't be a wash, it'd be like, oh, I don't care if it's a, 1,000 out of a million or a 10,000 out of a million. It seems like it would mean something, but the question is, how much would it mean to people, right? Like, would it mean significantly enough where if Tesla can provide, let's say, a similar price product as its competitors, that Tesla would have the advantage because of that difference? Or is it just a nominal amount? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I don't know. It's this is another one of those things where I think it's a really interesting question, and I don't trust my instincts to tell me, because I've got these conflicting data, points, and I don't really. And my general sense is that like trying to market safety is really fraught. There are definitely people who are they're going to buy the big car instead of the small car for their teenage kid because they want them to survive, right? But on the other hand, they're going to go with their sense of what is a safe vehicle. Like people don't actually go out and look at the statistics, because if they did, they'd know that rollover accidents and SUVs they have the highest fatality of any category of accident, right? And so maybe you would get your kid a station wagon or something like that. So they like the perception of safety, right? But they don't necessarily want to do homework on it, right? They want to feel safe. And they don't want that illusion broken. This is me sort of kind of cynically evaluating human beings' kind of market responses to safety. So, if it happened, I wouldn't be surprised, right? That would fit into the fabric. But I find it hard to have any confidence that it will happen, I guess is the right way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, another aspect of going out to just one more digit or just, being better than other competitors is I think it matters a lot more, especially in more difficult areas and countries. Like, for example, you go out to China, you go out to India, it's like if you're better than your competitors, you actually could be a lot better. Because the environment or the terrain, the signs, etc., are just maybe much more difficult, So I think in that sense, I think Tesla can also have a possible advantage where as long as it can stay ahead of the competition, that can open up new markets that other competitors have a hard time going into. The caveat to that, though, is in China, you've got a lot of native, AI machine learning talent that is focusing more and more efforts on autonomous driving, and they're going to be focusing on a domestic solution. They're going to be focusing on the China solution. And already, it seems like Tesla's having a hard time selling autopilot in China. Like customers aren't valuing it as much. Maybe it doesn't work as well right now. So that's a challenging thing too, Tesla's, I guess, prospects in China as well.
It doesn't make your car look any better when you have autopilot. I saw somebody ranking, somebody. So this was a Chinese person's ranking of like the weighting factors for selecting a car, and then his experience with American acquaintances and what he thought their rating things were. And I was shocked at what he thought the rate. Like it seemed super like what your friends think of your car. Like how high should that rate? Like should that be 1, 2, 3, or 4? Well, I mean, those kinds of social factors of what vehicle that you own ranked so much higher on his sort of evaluation of Chinese consumers' desires relative to his evaluation. And like, I don't know that much about Chinese consumers, but like his ranking system for what he thought Westerners wanted in a car, that actually seemed kind of more or less right to me, which, it didn't seem like he was intentionally skewing that the other way. But why doesn't China, why do they have a 1% take rate on, that was what Elon said on the call, right? It was, they got 1%, and I don't know, it's 20-30% or something like that in the US. That's a pretty shocking difference, which I'm inclined to think is cultural.
Yeah. That's interesting. Going back to, I want to push back on a little bit this idea that, let's say, Waymo and Cruise and others can have successful business models. I think in some ways, I could see that on some scale, but it would seem if Tesla can solve autopilot or autonomous driving, full self-driving in the next few years, it just seems their cost structure is so much lower than, let's say Waymo with LiDAR and all this stuff. And if they can get to a point where they're as good or better than even, let's say, Waymo, what chance does LiDAR or LiDAR-centric approach, or even, let's say, an approach that combines vision with LiDAR, it just is much more cost cumbersome, to do that. Tesla can just mob an area with, hundreds and thousands of cars. People will buy Tesla cars to deploy to different areas, and it's so cost effective. I mean, do other, competitors really have a chance?
I think when I think about this, I expect this to go through phases where things change quite dramatically, like from year to year for the first several years that this stuff is out there. So I always want to pick a time frame. It doesn't have to be in a date, but a circumstantial time frame to kind of talk about. Because when you talk about 20 years out, I really feel like it's going to be commoditized in 20 years. And I don't know exactly what the path is to getting there. And then when I think about, 3 years from now or 5 years from now, I kind of have a sense of what the landscape looks like. And one thing, my sense of the size of the market is such that Tesla's not going to have the production capacity to saturate the market for quite some years, right? Because I think it's, saturating and saturation is kind of a weird thing. If the robotaxis are $3 or $4 a mile, which is what they are right now, then saturation basically means about as many robotaxis as there are, taxis and rideshare cars out there today. So that's maybe several 100,000 or something like that, maybe 500,000 on that kind of scale, right? But the thing is, the cost basis for robotaxis is so low that you could drop, you could easily come down to $1 a mile and still make good money on the cars, right? And so how much does the addressable market increase if you go from $3 down to $1? It's a huge increase in the size of the market. So how many cars do you have to ship to saturate that market? And I think that number is more cars than Tesla can put into the market over the next 5 years, right? So the thing is, as long as we're in that zone, where Tesla can't have built. They simply don't have the production capacity to saturate the market. That means that there's going to be an opportunity for anybody who wants to compete at the price that they're at. So like, if Tesla sets the price to $2 or something, because that will fill all your taxis for the number of taxis that you have, right? And if Waymo or Cruise or some other player is willing to play it at $2, then it seems like there's going to be market for them, right? Because Tesla can't fill the capacity. And now that's only going to be true. The world's not going to take 100 million robotaxis, right? So there's going to be a point at which that stops being true, but it seems like it's pretty far down the road. So when I talk about, I feel like the market is big and these people can all be successful, I'm kind of talking about that window of frame where it hasn't been saturated. Like the world doesn't have all the robotaxis that it could probably, because one of the things is, eventually Tesla's going to ship this $25,000 car, right? And it's an electric vehicle. It goes 1 million miles. You could profitably sell taxi services out of that thing for 25 cents a mile. That it's shockingly lower than where we are today. This is talking way down the road. And cost of the amortization of the vehicle, the cost of the wear and tear and maintenance and that kind of stuff, and the cost of batteries and electricity and that kind of stuff to go into the thing. Yeah. They'll get down to like 15 cents a mile or something like that in terms of operating cost, maybe lower than that over time. So you could sell at 25 cents a mile. How big is the market at 25 cents a mile, and how long does it? How many taxis could the world take at that price point? And in a sense, I kind of feel like that ends up being Tesla's long-term advantage. It's not the nines. It's that they, they're on a ramp to scale to these crazy high manufacturing numbers of these electric vehicles that have super low maintenance, super low operating costs, super high reliability, incredibly long lifetimes, right? And they have the absolute cheapest, from a hardware standpoint, solution going into the autopilot. Like I look at that and I feel like 20 years from now, it's really hard to compete with that, because you have to have an industrial base that you've scaled to compete with them. And if they're successful in the EV space and to the extent that their aspirations are, that seems like a really hard thing to compete with. But then I look at this 5-year window and it just seems like it's impossible for anybody to saturate the market, because the demand for the services at the price point that robotaxis can provide relative to the existing market of human-driven services is so large.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It seems like, let's say, your 20-year, time frame, you're saying that Tesla has the whole package, right? They have the most reliable, the best built, lowest cost of operating vehicles. It's hard to compete maybe on that picture. But then would you say that, if Tesla is charging a lot for full self-driving, then competitors possibly, let's say in that view, just charge less for full self-driving? So, to compete with Tesla and to bring it a little bit more closer in time frame, for example, if there is a business model where, a company doesn't need to charge that much for full self-driving. Let's say Google releases full self-driving for free to OEMs. OEMs don't need to take a big cut. And so let's say they're able to offer autopilot for a lot cheaper than what Tesla wants to offer autopilot for. What do you think about that? Do you think that is a threat to Tesla, or how do you think, or is that a possibility even, or a major possibility? What are your
I
thoughts?
think there are all kinds of interesting strategic, machinations that could occur down the road, depending on the deals that various players need to cut in order to, survive, say. Maybe at some point you have an OEM that gets desperate and they'll cut any kind of deal, right, to do this kind of stuff. And then you could get something that's difficult to foresee that they do, right, in that kind of situation. But when I do this analysis, I really like to step back to like the rock solid economics and like sort of what does physics let you do? What is the technology going to be capable of doing? And that gets me to like that 15.8, like the model I have for like Tesla has them selling, $17,000 cars that they manufacture for like $13,000 or $14,000 in 2030, right? Like that's a cheap car. It's much cheaper than today. Uh, and if that's a robotaxi or whatnot, then you just can't get underneath that price. Like there's no ICE system there's no ICE system that you can sell in the Western world that's going to beat that, right? I mean, you can maybe trikes or something like that are more common in other places would compete on that kind of space. So then the other basic factors you get to is like, how many people will pay for the service at what price? And then there's a stack of people between the customer that rides in the taxi who pays for that service and then Tesla at the end, right? At the end, who's, selling the thing. So Tesla makes their money. Maybe they operate a fleet themselves, or maybe they're middlemen. Like maybe it's lots of little guys, or maybe they're fleet operators of some size that operate in between there. But you've got this stack of people who are going to get a chunk of that, say $1 that the customer pays on this. And so how much of that chunk can Tesla get, and how much can others get, and in what form does that happen? I mean, you get a certain amount of it can come up front in terms of like a fee for FSD on the day that the vehicle is bought, and other parts of it can come in service fees or subscription fees or whatnot down the road, and from Tesla's perspective, right? And the accounting for figuring out like what the best situation is for everybody, and that can be kind of complicated. There's cost of money over time, and there's the ease of financing depending on the investability of various sectors and all that kind of stuff. And that all seems super complicated to me. So I like to just like, here's $1. How much can Tesla reasonably expect to get out of that? And then try to back out what's that's worth. But it doesn't give you, you don't have a spreadsheet with 1,000 numbers that you can put in, but it's some pretty simple rock solid numbers to do with your analysis. And then the only thing you really have to guess at, the one sort of fudge factor that you're sticking in there is like, I'm going to guess that they can collect, that the Tesla's got enough market power that they can take 50 cents of that dollar. Or I'm going to guess that they won't be super strong and they won't have market power. Or maybe they're more intent on expanding the fleet and expanding miles in the vehicles than they are in making money, and they only take 10%, right? But that seems like the reasonable range. It's hard to imagine them taking more than 50 because there's other people downstream. Like you want to give some of it to the customer to give them an incentive to ride in your taxi instead of somebody else's. And you want to give some of it to the fleet operator, right? Because otherwise there won't be any fleet operators if they can't make any money. They want to make a good living. You want to distribute these vehicles as fast as you can. So you kind of have those numbers. But if you say, the price is $1, right? Well, how many of those how many miles can you sell in cars, right? Like a fascinating thing, if you take that $1 number and you say, so what's a Model 3 with full self-driving worth at $1 a mile? If it's a million-mile car, it's worth $1 million, right? I like that it's very simple math, right? And you know exactly what the assumptions are going into that kind of thing. So if Tesla if they can capture 10% of that $1 million, that's $100,000. And right now they make $10,000 on a Model 3. And if they're now making $100,000 on a Model 3, well, whatever you thought about their enterprise value for their vehicle division before, well, it's now 10x because they were making $10,000. Now they're making $110,000, right? And that's just assuming that they captured 10%. So this analysis, it doesn't require you to try to figure out the details of the business model. You're just basically asking what's it worth and what do you think Tesla can reasonably get out of it? And then you're letting the what you know about what can be manufactured at what price point, and then you can make reasonable guesses about, like, if the only constraint on how many miles they can sell is how many cars they can build, and that if they do come down to $1 at some point, they'll be totally limited on how many vehicles they can make for a really long time, right? Because in the world, that's a lot of vehicles at $1. And now that's $1 a mile in the Western world, but it's already cheaper. Like I understand that ride-hail services in China are already cheaper than that. So maybe China is a completely different market. And maybe the way that Tesla loses the Chinese market is that they want to be iOS or they want to be the Apple store. And you've got somebody else who's willing to be Android in China.
Yeah. Okay. So with your model of let's say $1 per mile, and Tesla taking, let's say, 10 to 50% of that, let's say dollar per mile, a Model 3, or let's say the feature $25,000 car is also a 1,000,000-mile car. So $1 million in full self-driving value. Tesla captures 100,000 at 10%, more if it's higher. Is that limited though in terms of the ride-hailing market at $1 per mile? Meaning, what if there isn't, obviously it's going to be bigger than the ride-hailing market right now at, let's say, $3 per mile. But what if there's an inherent type of cap where, it doesn't grow as much as maybe people expected at $1 a mile? So is there some growth limitations there as well?
Well, what would be candidates for a cap? I mean, certainly I cannot deny the possibility that those things might exist.
So for example,
but what would you think it would be?
Yeah. So for example, it seems like another alternative would be owning the car, owning full self-driving, right? And so let's say I'm commuting to work, and let's say hypothetically I drive 20,000 miles per year in my car commuting to work. The question is like, how much am I going to pay, extra to use full self-driving, hypothetically, commuting to work? How much value, right, am I accruing and willing to pay for, over than just driving myself, right, to work? So at 20,000 miles a year, typically most people aren't going to pay $20,000 for that privilege to be driven to work and back. That's a hefty fee to pay, just to be driven. Most people, I mean, that's like what, actually more than $1,500 per month. So about $1,700 per month just to drive.
I agree
to be driven, right?
People pay about 50, 60, 70 cents to drive cars today. Like that's the real cost of driving cars. So yeah, paying $1 for a taxi to drive you, that would definitely increase your cost of commuting. Now you would get your time back, but maybe some people don't value that.
Exactly.
But so that affects what a private purchaser will pay for FSD for themselves. So for like an upfront or for a subscription fee, it does. But in a world, as long as Tesla's production limited, if they have a fleet operator that's willing to pay them $300,000 for the car, and they have a private operator who's not willing to pay $300,000 for the car, a lot of the volume is going to end up going to the fleets, right? I mean, there will be some kind of reconciliation between those two markets. If you have a large customer base, whether it's industrial or some other customers or whatnot, which is willing to pay you several times more for the cars, and this is a car that, Tesla's making a $50,000 car, they're selling a $50,000 car and they're making $10,000 on it right now. So if if a different entity is willing to pay them $60,000 for the car, that doubles how much money they make on it, right?
True,
and if, I mean, it's ridiculously larger if the number goes to $100,000. And my analysis suggests it's really not hard. It is crazily simple to justify a $100,000 valuation at point of sale for like a Robotaxi for that service today.
Sure. I mean, if we go back to this, let's say 20,000 mile commuter, who's not willing to pay 20,000 a year for this extra service to drive themselves, maybe, and a lot of it is a function of how much they earn, how much they value their time in terms of how much they're willing to pay for the service. So let's say a person is only willing to pay, $300 a month max to be driven 20,000 miles a year, right? So that's what, $3,600 to be driven, 20,000 miles per year. And what I'm saying is that this is radically lower, than let's say $1 per mile. But it seems like this would be in a sense, the competition, for the ride-hailing dollar per market type of thing. Because if you have the ability first to drive yourself, right, cheaper, right, just in a normal car.
So are you talking about the 20-year time frame? Are you talking about the 5-year time frame? When you
more like a 10-year time frame. Yeah.
So are you imagining that the taxi market is saturated at this point?
Yeah, exactly. I guess what I'm saying is like, I'm not sure when the taxi market will be saturated. It seems like, part of the model where you're modeling a dollar per mile and then having Tesla accrue profits is in this window of opportunity. Let's say where
the price is not going to stay
exactly.
The price is going to come down.
Yeah.
Right? And no, I think in the long run, it gets commoditized. I really believe that. Now, I don't know if the long run is 10 years or 20 years. I would bet that it's closer to 20 years than it is to 10. Because I think the manufacturing infrastructure for saturating the taxi market will be insufficient to saturate it inside the next 10 years. That's a swag on my part about, like, I could back it up. I have some numbers and that kind of stuff, but that requires an assumption about how big the addressable market of cars is at a particular point, how many cars can be made, and that requires you to guess things about things we haven't ever seen before. We've never seen $1 taxi services in the Western world, so we don't know how popular they will be. So you have to guess at that, and I'm unwilling to like make the guess outside of super broad boundaries. But once the taxi market saturates, the value of FSD comes down. It comes down a lot. It's not a $100,000 option when the taxi market is saturated, because, as you point, the marginal customer is now the guy who wants to own his own car. Right. And he's not going to pay $100,000 for it, especially if there are other competitors that will sell it to him for less. So in the long run, I think it does get commoditized. But I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to when you think about this stuff is to understand, there are these phases. Like there's the phase where we're selling robotaxis into a market where the price is set by human beings, right? Because at that point, the price is $3 or $4 a mile, right? And your profitability and the attractiveness to the fleet operators is all based on, a pretty tall revenue stack. And you're also in a window there where the market is woefully undersupplied, right? Because the manufacturing, the worldwide manufacturing capability for robotaxis isn't capable of doing it. So there will be that window, and it, you can talk about how long it'll last, but it's probably 3-5 years at least, right? Where it's a super attractive business, and it's super, super profitable, and it's totally limited by production capacity, right? And then you go 20 years down the road where there are several people who can make a perfectly viable thing, and can put it in a car, and there'll be other EV manufacturers besides Tesla, and there will be these $15,000 robotaxis that are operating at 10% margin. I don't know if their operating cost is 15%, then maybe they charge 17 cents a mile or something like that. And that's the competition for the guy who wants to drive himself, right? Is like, well, I can get my own EV at 17 cents a mile and pay some marginal amount, or I can take the robotaxi at 17 cents a mile. Like that's what's way down the road. So in the extreme case, the robotaxi also wins because it amortizes its value over a lot more miles. Whereas, the private owner has to amortize the same value. And assuming it's a competitive market, they're going to pay about the same for the self-driving in their car as the taxi operator does, and that kind of stuff. Then there's this window in between where where private owners matter a lot because they're the marginal buyers, because the taxi market is saturated and they're not willing to pay a lot because the taxi price is still high. So yeah, I think, there are windows where all of these different sets of scenarios will change the dynamics of how the pricing works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean,
I think about it.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm curious in terms of, it seems like there's a discrepancy here of the value that full self-driving has in a robotaxi ride-hailing network, let's say hypothetically $1 per mile, versus what a typical consumer might want to pay for full self-driving, because it's a function of the value of their time, right, and their income in a sense. It seems like that's a big discrepancy. I mean,
it's huge. Incidentally, it's not just a difference in like how they value their time, but the thing is, a private owner of a vehicle doesn't put that many miles on it. So even if their time is pretty valuable to them, we're talking about a small number of miles, right? And as soon as you get into the robotaxi scenario, the mileage massively increases, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just the fundamental utility of having FSD in a taxi from an economic standpoint, it's just much, much higher than it is in a personal vehicle. And I think that's going to persist as long as we have personal vehicles and robotaxis, the robotaxi version. So, which is why you get this weird kind of lumpy thing. You get this window in the beginning where it's way more valuable to the Robotaxi. And then you get a window at the end where it's also a lot more valuable to the Robotaxi because of the amortization. And then somewhere in the middle, you get this zone where pricing might actually be driven by the private vehicle owner because they're the marginal buyer at that point.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Because I'm wondering if the typical customer is only willing to pay $300 a month or something, maybe even less, I don't know. But it seems like that would cap the price that Tesla could pay to a customer who's not intending to lease out or lend out their car to the Robotaxi market in a sense, right?
I have a good friend, and we have a long-standing bet. He and I have been talking about this for about a decade now. This coming, robo apocalypse of cars. So we have a bet, and his bet is that Tesla will inevitably stop selling cars to private parties during this window of time because the economic incentive, not just for Tesla to make more money, but also to satisfy their mission, right? The thing is, every Robotaxi they sell in a short window of time is going to eliminate 1 million ICE miles, right? And every car they sell to a private party is going to eliminate far less than 1 million ICE miles, right? So both from the standpoint of their mission and from the standpoint of economics, because the fundamental economic value of the thing is, so he believes that Tesla will be forced to just stop selling vehicles to private individuals. That inevitably that happens.
Yeah, I mean,
I do not believe that. But,
yeah, I mean,
but I'm not sure how to reconcile it.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense where, hypothetically, if it's, I don't know, let's say a Robotaxi does 100,000 miles, and then, well, let's say Robotaxi does 100,000 miles, Tesla gets, let's say $1 per mile, that's 100,000, but Tesla gets 10% hypothetically. That's $10,000 in a year. I mean, these are super conservative probably, but it seems like for Tesla to want to sell a car to a regular person outside of the Robotaxi network, it should be comparable in some senses to what they would get, let's say. I mean, it's a market dynamic, so people would be willing to pay a higher price to put it on the Robotaxi network to get that extra income. So it would kind of crowd out the market in a sense where people who are just using it for themselves and aren't willing to pay a super high premium on that usage just can't afford it. But people who are willing to pay a huge premium for their own usage and not put it on the Robotaxi, maybe they'll be allowed to buy the package.
Yeah, but it'll just cost you.
It costs you a lot. Or you could.
It'll depend on what it costs. Because if it when I said 10%, that's a pretty low ball figure. There's all kinds of swags in there. How big is the market, and how many vehicles does Tesla make? That's a really big swag, right? And I think they're going to execute, but people may differ on that.
Yeah.
But that 10%, because that 10% could be 50%. That's a 5x multiplier. Like if Tesla can reasonably capture 50% of that, or 50 cents of that dollar, or 50% of that $3 or whatever the deal is, there's no competition, right? It's just ridiculous. The Robotaxi is worth to Tesla. Selling a Robotaxi is worth them I don't know, 50 times what a private vehicle is. The number is scary.
Yeah, I mean, if it's 50,000 per year, I mean, over 5 years, that's 250. I mean, it seems like it would, there's 3 different categories. One is, let's say, the private owner who's willing to fork over a lot to use it themselves, apart from the Robotaxi network. Then there's a private customer who's willing to fork over some, but they're willing to let their car be used in the Robotaxi network a lot, right, to justify it. And then there seems to be the use case of just buying it for the Robotaxi network completely, just putting it on it. And then those would be kind of perhaps the use cases or of owners. And then there would be the case of just Tesla producing their own cars, putting it on the network, getting their own income. That seems like kind of the most straightforward. In some ways, because you don't have to deal with a third party and all that extra. I mean, what are your thoughts?
There's the time value of money thing, right? It's if Tesla can get financing to you know, I I wouldn't be surprised if by then it's possible for Tesla to get financing. But selling vehicles to other parties that deal with the financing and operating it at a profit and that kind of stuff, and for Tesla to get the money up front so that they can turn right around and build a lot more vehicles or build more factories or build more solar panel plants or whatever. I think there's a window of time where that makes a lot of sense. But in the long run, yeah, maybe if financing is super easy for that kind of stuff, so that they can just own the car that comes off the end of the production line, then it may make sense.
Yeah.
It's in the long run, it probably doesn't make sense because the
Yeah.
marginal value goes down like 20, 30 years from now. It doesn't make sense,
Yeah.
right? Because Tesla's cost of capital and fleet operators' cost of capital, I think, is going to be, and their expectations for margin on that capital are going to be different, right? And so you get to a world like where we are right now. Like GM doesn't run a fleet of taxis, even though they build all the taxis, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, what happens though? Let's say hypothetically, there's this window of opportunity where Tesla can release cars that completely decimate taxis or human driven, ride hailing or taxis. And they can't make enough of it, right? And so they're able to, for a period of time, to accrue a lot of revenue and profit. I mean, we're talking about perhaps ridiculous amounts of revenue and profit. I mean, off of 1 million cars, just off of 1 million.
Well, think of that window of time where the going rate is like $3 a mile, right? And I said 10%. If they the other end of the thing is they get 50% of $3 a mile on vehicles that go 1 million miles. Like that's crazy.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you have to.
It's $1.5 million, right?
That's true.
They're going from making $10,000 a vehicle to $1.5 million a vehicle. Like that's a crazy, crazy multiplier.
Yeah.
Like you can put your own weighting on how likely that scenario is, but the upper bound of reasonable numbers is very high.
Yeah. I mean, you have to assume that people would prefer or give equal weight to a human-driven car versus a robot-driven car.
Well, $3 is cheaper than your average ride-hailing ride, I think, in San Francisco right now. So they could just want to save $1 a mile on their trip to the grocery store in San Francisco.
Yeah. I mean, you have this window of opportunity. I would imagine that a few things happen. One is perhaps in whatever way Tesla, a lot of cars end up as robotaxis in some form. And what happens, I guess, in this bigger picture? I mean, have you thought out, does competition flood to the scene because it's just so lucrative? Does everybody copy Tesla's approach? Are they just too late in a sense where it takes them at least a few years just to be able to, release something? So is there a window where you think that Tesla is going to be relatively free to do whatever they want? And how long do you think that window would last for?
I think they have a head start on their business model, right? They're clearly behind Waymo and Waymo's business model. I think when you get to scale, that Tesla's model outcompetes Waymo's model because the cost of their vehicles is so much lower, right? And there's a point where that becomes important. Waymo would argue, and a lot of people would argue, that that might be quite a ways off, and it might be. Maybe it'll take a while. It depends on how fast you expect the market to scale and how fast you expect the technology to improve. But in Tesla's business model, like, who's number two? Who's going to be, and how far behind Tesla are they? I actually don't know who number two is. I don't have a good candidate. I mean, the obvious ones are Comma and Mobileye, right? Those are the two people who have sort of declared an intention to kind of go in that space. And Comma is such a dark horse, it's hard to really know what the possibilities are. And Mobileye has structured their business model in a way where they're going to sell into OEMs, right? And OEMs are pretty conservative about building out stuff. I mean, no OEMs have talked about using Mobileye to build a taxi service, although Mobileye themselves is developing a technology and they feel like they're well on that way. And so if they get a system together, they could certainly become credible competition. How far is Mobileye behind Tesla? in technology. And there are a lot of people who really like Mobileye, and they will argue pretty vehemently with this number. But I think Tesla has at least a few years head start on getting, a robotaxi fleet out there over Mobileye for various reasons. But I think that's pretty hard to defend. The whole window of time. That whole window of time, though, the market it won't be saturated with vehicles, right? So both Mobileye and Tesla in that window, I feel like, can build as many cars as they want and put them out on the road until they start bumping into each other, 5 years down the road or something like that.
Got it. And what are your thoughts on valuation? Like, how is Tesla valued at this time when, let's say, they have massive amounts of profits, but then it could be more of a short-term thing. Like it could be a window where, and like how are you interpreting or kind of foreseeing this scenario play out? I mean, do you think Tesla can use this window to build something more sustainable in terms of profitability, or is it just inevitable that it's a window where it closes at a certain time?
That's why the entertainment thing is kind of an interesting question. So if you just think about the transportation as a service bit of it, right? So the profitability is it's gonna have a curve like this, right? Where it's in the beginning it's limited by this is the unit profitability, right? I mean the price starts high and just goes down, and then but the cost of service starts at some point. Which is relatively high and comes down. So the unit profitability kind of goes up for a little while, and then it goes on this long, relentless downward curve. But at the same time, Tesla's aspirational build out curve and the curve that they've followed so far is this, it's a 60% CAGR, and Elon has said that he thinks that they'll continue to scale 50% a year. And like when I look at what they're building right now, that seems, at least for the next several years, that they have the good potential to that. So if this is going up at 50%, even if this is going down, the total profitability of the company, it kind of spikes up in the beginning, but then it does okay. It continues to climb because they're increasing the number of units on the street much faster than the price is coming down, right? So the profitability of the company in terms of the amount of money that they're making per, year of or even per vehicle, I think continues to go up for some significant amount of time. At the tail end of that window, like if they get to the end of the wheel, they have this completely unassailable economic position in terms of the amount of capital they've managed to accrue and the size of the fleet and the number of assets that they have out there. So it seems to me like that can probably be leveraged into a 30-year long kind of market dominant position, even if they don't own the entire market, right? But if you ended up being 25% of the transportation as a service volume for the world, man, what's 25% of transportation worth? That's nuts. Like there's never been a company in history that was remotely that big. Their sovereign governments don't have budgets the size of that, right? It's a huge, huge number. Yeah, the sky is just crazy high on the thing. I feel like the valuation numbers that you get in the optimistic scenario are so high, they're difficult to swallow. Or difficult. That was earlier when I asked about that whole, $10 trillion versus $20 trillion company thing. Like, if you do some math and you get a number that says, "Oh, I think this company is going to be worth $50 trillion," you go, "Okay, let's do that again." Right? You're just like unwilling to accept, like even if you feel like all your assumptions are reasonable, you look at the outcome. I think that's one of the reasons that you don't see analysts coming out with numbers. They don't do a simple analysis, the napkin analysis that I just did, like, $3 a mile, 1 million miles a car. Tesla keeps 50%. Like nobody does the napkin analysis and suggests that that's plausible. And it's not because there's no credibility to the napkin analysis. It's a fine analysis, right? It's particularly, it's totally reasonable in a short window of time. But you get a valuation out of that where the clients will just laugh. If you're an analyst and you put that in a note, people will cancel their subscription, right? Because they'll think you've gone crazy,
Yeah. I mean, a big part of it, though, is you're coming from the angle where you're understanding the technology, you're seeing how much it's taking to get to this point, how the underlying technology is growing. It's not just Tesla. It's there's a whole ecosystem of, just hundreds and thousands of companies working on various parts of what's going on with the chips and the technologies and various parts. And so you're seeing the bigger picture, and you're seeing the inevitable trajectory of Tesla being able to solve autonomous driving. And therefore it's a new market, it's a new use case for cars, and it makes sense for you to come up with a napkin math interpretation of that. Whereas a typical analyst, they're skeptical of everything, right? They're like, I don't understand what this whole thing is all about anyways. Like, is it just hype?
Things that sound too good to be true
Exactly.
are, right?
Yeah, right?
Almost without exception.
It just sounds all hype, It's like, is autonomous driving ever going to come, in 20 years, right? That's the typical analyst view. So that's why the napkin math also, that's another reason why they wouldn't even look at it. They're not going to entertain napkin math at all. But I mean, do you have any kind of figures that you think that personally, not obviously as suggestions, but personally that you think are realistic during that window? Like, for example, number of cars times profit per car. Do you have any kind of like figures or numbers that?
I have a spreadsheet, but I don't want to talk about the numbers. I have the whole analyst thing. Like, I'm not going to sound credible if I just break out the numbers. It's true. Like, I did the spreadsheet and I showed it to my girlfriend, and I've showed that spreadsheet to a couple of people. And I'm like, so tell me what's wrong with this, and they'll come out with that can't be right, and it's got to be this problem, and we'll talk through that one, or it's got to be this problem, or whatever the deal is. And I'm unconvinced by any of those. I mean, you can certainly throw a lot of rocks at it, right? Because there are all these models have assumptions in it. But the great thing about the napkin math one is it's only got a couple of assumptions, right? It's a very simple model. It's only got a couple of assumptions in it. And like, do we really think that Tesla will only be able to capture 1% of the value, right? I mean, so the napkin math thing is like, what's the Robotaxi worth, right? And it's got some really simple things. Well, this is what people pay per mile in a car. This is how many miles that car can drive, right? So, it can do 100,000 a year, and over 10 years it gets 1 million, and then you throw it away, or whatever the deal is. Like, that's the basic model. And there aren't really good arguments against that right now, as the 3-year kind of window on this kind of stuff. So those seem to me like pretty simple. If you want to come back and you say, no, robotaxis, people only pay 10 cents a mile to ride a robotaxi, or people will only pay $1 in a mile. Well, to me, it seems like if that might be true, right? I have to admit that it's possible, but that seems unlikely to the point where I feel like I want some evidence if I'm going to assume that. Like, it seems to me like it'll do that they can do that. Or if you say, well, the cars won't go 1 million miles, they'll go 1 million miles. Trust me. Like, I'm not going to take that at all. I mean, maybe it's 700,000 or something, but we already know they don't break at 100. There are people with old versions of Tesla systems that have gone 300 on the thing. And if they start using lithium iron phosphate batteries, and the battery doesn't even wear out, right? That's a 1 million mile battery on day one really easily. Like, there are so many ways to get to 1 million miles that I don't think that's a concern. So that's the two big assumptions that go into the napkin math model that could potentially shoot it down. And then the whole, how much can Tesla capture? If competition comes flooding in and totally catches up, or, if Waymo scales faster than Tesla does, right? And doesn't care about losing money, or can drop the cost of their vehicles to the point where the amortization of the vehicle doesn't. I mean, it's in the short run, it's, Waymo's vehicles can be perfectly profitable. But I think Waymo actually has a scaling problem with they're building them on I-Paces. It's an electric I-Pace. So do we really think that Jaguar is going to start building I-Paces at a rate which dwarfs all the vehicles that Tesla makes, right? Because that's the contention if you're pushing the Waymo argument, right? And I don't believe that one either. So then it's a super simple model. It's got a couple of assumptions that go into it, and it produces these unreasonable valuations,
Yeah.
right?
That you're ashamed to share.
Well, yeah, I just, you can put conservative numbers in there and it's a 10x on the
Sure,
value of
sure.
Tesla's car business,
I
right?
mean,
And so to some extent, it doesn't
yeah,
really matter what
yeah,
the thing is because, if you can get a call option with it's
yeah,
got that kind of pop at this price, it doesn't really matter if it goes up 1,000% or 10,000%, right? It's
yeah,
still a good buy.
yeah. I mean, it seems like just some feedback or some, you know, trying to poke some holes in this.
Hmm.
It seems like part of the model, a lot of it is dependent on this dollar per mile or whatever cost per mile, but also and some sustainability of that. Like for example, it doesn't just tank right away, because let's say a car lasts 100 or a million miles, it needs to. I mean, it seems like it would probably go down each year or something if there's more supply. So the more supply of
Right.
autonomous cars on the market, it seems like the price per mile would go
Right.
down, right? And then
There's definitely a point where it
yeah,
tapers.
exactly.
If you make reasonable assumptions
Hmm.
about the number of vehicles that you can sell into the market, and you look at the manufacturing capacity for those vehicles, this is me, I
Yeah,
look at that thing, and it seems to me that it is a significant number of years before the supply can reasonably saturate the market, and that the price doesn't tank until you get to that point. So yeah, there's this window of time, which is
yeah,
there's this Goldilocks window for the self-driving stuff where it's crazily. I mean, there's such a huge gap between the operating cost of a human-driven vehicle and the operating cost of a robotaxi. It's just gigantic.
yeah,
And so the thing is, the first robotaxis that come in, they're going into a vacuum where they're just overwhelmingly profitable, right? And yeah, and when you have a deal like that, people, you take it as many times as you can. But of course that ends
yeah,
eventually. I mean, you're going to push down the prices to some extent, but the human-driven taxi cab, they can't push their prices down too much. People got to eat. So, there's a limit to that. And it takes a significant amount of time before you've built out enough infrastructure that those guys can all go home or they can find another job, right? Because there just aren't enough robotaxis. And then when the price starts coming down, then the market expands, right? And
that's
I mean,
true.
the reasonable size expectation of the expansion of the market between like $3 and $1 in the Western world, that's you know at the tail end of this, at the long end of that curve, taking a robotaxi ends up being a lot less expensive than owning a car. Like that's the end game for this thing, right? But and that's just simply if all the technology is the same that's going in the regular cars, and the robotaxi is amortizing its cost over a lot more miles than the private vehicle is. So it's inevitably cheaper to do that. So basically everybody who's really cost sensitive, and maybe that's far enough in the future, I don't know. It seems to me like there will always be people who are pretty cost sensitive. That's the option they're going to choose. And how big is that transportation market? It's many trillions of miles a year. That's the long-term game in between here. So we can kind of talk about what it looks like in the short term if we're willing to
Yeah,
make assumptions about, if Tesla doesn't get it working for 10 years, it's a very different world
yeah,
because they've got a lot more cars out there. If and Waymo will have a much bigger head start.
yeah,
They'll have figured out how to scale. They'll have brought their vehicle costs down, right? So
yeah,
there are scenarios where it doesn't work out so great for Tesla, but they require you to assume that it's going to take quite a long time before they can
yeah,
get this technology. And maybe that's the big bet. Maybe analysts are looking at this thing and they're doing all the same napkin math and whatnot, and their assumption is just like it's not going to work for 10 years, right?
yeah. Yeah, I definitely think there aren't many analysts who even, you know, understand like the underpinnings of what Tesla is doing, and therefore it makes it difficult for them to really analyze it or to model it with any models because the possibilities are just so slim in their mind, that Tesla can actually make a car that drives itself at scale. Definitely interesting stuff. I mean, this past or about a week and a half ago, I was thinking just like, what is the minimum? And this is obviously all this stuff is personal conjecture, opinion, guesswork. We're not making any predictions here, but I was thinking, if Tesla sells 5 million cars a year, let's say, in roughly 5 year period, in 5 years or so, how much can they make per car, and it's kind of like a super simple model where maybe we don't factor in all of the Robotaxi network, per usage or per, the cut. We just simply have two figures, a number of cars per year they sell and a minimum number of profit they can make. It maybe that's some type of number that factors in, future profit a little bit, I don't know, or something, or because there's going to be also current cars on the road as robotaxis being utilized and Tesla accruing profit. So there might be actually a ton of other revenue streams, but if we just pare it down to a simple, let's say 5 million cars, what's kind of like a minimum number or of profit per car, that maybe they could achieve? And I'm thinking most people are thinking, typical, like, okay, if they're selling,
it's like in 2025, right?
Yeah, 2025,
2024.
Yeah, 2025 or so. Let's say they sell $30,000 per car, and then they make 15% net profit or something, off of. So maybe they make $6,000 per car, off of that. And I'm just thinking, like, that's not factoring in. I mean, even with that, that's not factoring in that what Tesla is really doing. It's not factoring in. It's still working, I think, from the paradigm of you've got these dumb cars that people drive, and that's the use case. It's not factoring in. We're talking about a whole different. I think what's tricky is it's a different product. It looks the same. It looks like a car. It looks like, something you drive, but it's not. It's a different complete use case. And that's the thing that kind of tricks people, where they don't realize how big of a difference. This is Tesla releasing a completely new product line, of I don't even know if you can compare it in the same product line, of a dumb car that you have to drive versus a car that drives yourself, a robot that drives yourself. But because it looks the same, it tricks people where it's hard to distinguish that, where I think the tendency is people to say, okay, this is going to get car-like margins, maybe max 15% net margin or whatever. But if Tesla really proves this out, and it seems like they're on track to eventually solve this at some point, and if they have that window of opportunity where they have a few years lead, and the competition is a $3 or whatever, robotaxi ride-hailing network, and they can undercut it tremendously, it just seems like it's obvious that they're going to make a lot more than $5,000 per car. Like it seems like.
But the weird thing is that you say, what your inclination is to say, oh, could they make $7,000 or $8,000 a car, something like that? And then you're like, no, they're going to make $250,000 a car, and it just breaks the model.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay, wait, let's walk that back.
Yeah. But I mean, even if I make kind of like this hypothetical, let's say, I want to say worst case, but it's a low case scenario in my mind. Let's say $10,000 per car, which again, it doesn't make you even if you don't factor in much, you just say they have I don't know, they're making a little bit hypothetically.
You can only fit so much sand in your bags.
Yeah, but let's say even if you do $10,000 per net profit per car, that's 5 million cars. That's basically $50 billion of net profit for a company that you're gonna give a multiple of at least 50 off of that, because this is just the beginning. It's just the beginning.
Depending on how much people like Tesla at that point.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I get uncomfortable with. Like, I guess PE ratios when I do valuation models, but it's always the thing that's the most, because you see even PE ratios on like the whole S&P 500, like they double and halve and double and halve depending on how people feel.
Yeah, but I mean,
so a company like Tesla, I see remember Amazon had a 250 PE ratio back at a time when they were incredibly cheap, and everybody thought it was outrageous, right?
Yeah.
So PE ratios are hard.
Yeah, but I mean, like even, I mean, yeah, off of net profit of a company that's growing super fast. I mean, P50 I think is super conservative, but even that's a $2.5 trillion market cap, in 5 years. But that,
Yeah. So
I
if you
mean,
discount that to today, you get $1,000, right? So,
sure. But I think that's hard for people to accept who look at Tesla as a car company, and and it's hard to get out of the box of Tesla building cars, like dumb cars, I think that's the tricky part is I think the same thing with Apple. Like Apple released the iPhone and they called it a phone, and in a way it tricked people to think that Apple was a phone company in a way where it took a while for people to understand that this isn't a phone. Like this is completely going to revolutionize people's lives. It's going to do everything that a computer can do and more in a sense. But I think that's also an opportunity in a sense. I think they will minimize what Tesla's doing with autonomous driving because the form factor looks like it's something that's always been here. It's been done, a car. And but it's definitely, I think, it's one of the most, I think, revolutionary consumer products that we've seen since the iPhone, in terms of how drastically it could affect day-to-day life and in the amount of people, the scope of people in day-to-day life. Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts kind of on this topic?
I think we're going to have to split this in half because I think we just went 2 hours and we went into next week's topic already, so.
Yeah. Actually, we'll wrap this up. So this is, I'll include this talk. It's actually, it might have gone.
Well, maybe you do want to cut it.
Yeah, maybe we do. Yeah.
Record an intro for the second half.
That's true. Yeah, fun stuff. I always have fun talking with you, James. Definitely.
Thanks.
Yeah, I learned a lot.
I'm having fun too.
Yeah, cool, man. I'd love to. Yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff. I feel like this stuff is just so fascinating to me. I want to ask if you could consider sharing your model. Maybe if you can get some screen sharing, something set up. We'll make a bunch of disclaimers on how this is not, a rational.
It's not.
It's not a rational person's model. We'll make a bunch of disclaimers.
Yeah, it's not. But here's the deal. At the end of the day, right? Like, so if you're a competitor to Tesla or you're doing industrial policy, right? Then a number that's like really huge versus a number that's ridiculous, like it matters to you, right? Because there's a point at which it distorts all the things around it, right? Yeah. And if you're one of those things that's going to get distorted, it matters, right? But for you and me, we're just talking about as individual investors, what do we think about this as an investment opportunity? It doesn't really change it's a call option, essentially, right? Which we basically get for free because like my evaluation is the stock price is basically, as you suggested. I mean, analysts look at this thing, they're like, I don't understand that part. I'm going to give it a value of 0. Right? I mean, which is, to me, it's always kind of funny that they have this implicit assumption. We're assuming that Tesla is dumb enough that they're going to keep spending money developing this forever, but that they never make any money on it, right? We're going to keep taking the expense, but we're not going to give them any profit. But what else can you do when you're an analyst? It's any other, you're guessing a number. And somehow guessing 0 feels safe. Like if they guessed any other number, they'd have to justify it. But you can guess 0 and you don't have to justify it at all, right? Yeah. So, and the net effect as an investor is, well, you just get a call option on that possibility, right? You're paying what the underlying chunk of the stock is worth, and then how much that option is worth to you is based on what you think your evaluation of the potential, of the upside potential for the thing, the realistic upside potential. But the thing is, any meaningful upside potential, it gives you the same, decision with respect to the investment, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why I feel like the particular, I really am embarrassed to show this model because there are two things. Like, I am so before I built my model, I went and I looked at other people's models, right? Like Arc has a model and they publish it, and I got plenty of respect. I like the stuff that they say, and they look at all kinds of really interesting industries and stuff. And I looked at their model, and like I felt like it just sandbagged things. Like the whole approach kind of sandbagged autonomy, but then they sandbag a bunch of other things. But at the end of their model, they get this really high valuation, which is a big part of that is based on autonomy. You know what PE ratio that they gave for autonomy in their model? I don't know if you ever looked at it.
I did look at it, but I forget. I mean,
14.
14, yeah. I think part of their model was they discounted, or they have several scenarios where autonomy doesn't work out at all, and that's, I think,
they do that.
Yeah.
You can go into their model and you can set all those probabilities to like whatever you can set that probability to 100, and you can set the bankruptcy probability down to 0, and you get a pretty decently high number, right? You get a number that's high enough that like Arc wouldn't want to put that in there. That wouldn't be the top line on their research note. That number is like way too high. Because I think you just do those numbers in their model and you get like a $20,000 price target or something like that, right? Yeah. Which just seems nuts for 2025 or 2026 or whatever their thing is. But even so, I looked through their models and it was sandbagging, and I didn't really like the approach that they took because they have too many numbers that you guess in the model. Yeah. So I wanted to do the really simple napkin model. It would only dependent on a couple parameters, and then you have to guess things like, well, how much are they going to charge up front for FSD, and how much are they going to make on the back end for the Robotaxi guys? How many of the cars in the fleet go to Robotaxi users? You just have to make those guesses if you're going to build a model, and you want it to be continuous over time. And I don't want to have to defend any of those numbers. But the thing is, no matter how you set those numbers, it looks kind of ridiculous. I didn't want to do the thing where like I lowballed all the numbers so that the end number ends up sounding digestible and reasonable to people, because I just want, I did for each one of them, I did a quick little Monte Carlo analysis, and I'm saying, well, here's the highest it could be on these reasonable assumptions, and here's the lowest it could be, and let's split the difference and put that one. And I put all those numbers in, and the valuation I get is just obscene. Yeah. So, and like it just like the idea of trying to defend that model, it cringes me, even though I've got an argument for every single one of them. It's the nature of models where they're based on assumptions, right? Yeah, exactly. A simple model has to have these global assumptions that are hard to defend. It just will. And so people build really detailed models so that you can argue with them about the number that went in B22 or whatever the deal is. And you miss the much bigger picture that the whole methodology could be. Like, any model, the first thing you have to do is defend the methodology. Yeah. And, mostly analysts, they all build the model the same way. So their defense is, well, I built it just the way we've always built models. Not that it's a good way to do it. And they get a pass on that. And I don't like any of those things about modeling. So instead, I like a simple, easy to understand model with the smallest number of parameters. And where you can swag them, right? You can say, this is the lowest that could reasonably be. This is the biggest it could reasonably be. And ideally, you put the middle number in. And if you do that process through all the things, a reasonable person should be willing to accept what the number that comes out of the model is. And the biggest problem I have with it is, like, there's only so much money. I mean, there's a point where the success starts to distort the playing field itself, right? Sure. Because I mean, Google and Facebook are fantastically successful entities, not on the scale that I think Tesla could be successful on, but they're really successful. And as you become, look at what's happened with Facebook, right? Yeah. They have distorted the whole media environment that they occupied before, to the point where all of these things that you couldn't possibly have imagined happening at the beginning when they started their business, like, what is it? Twitter cancels the account of the president of the United States, and it's a huge deal, right? Like, that's the kind of thing that invites the kind of regulatory scrutiny that you couldn't possibly have imagined going into that, and yet it could end up being one of those defining things for what happens with their platform in the long run. So, like, those are the things that I am more concerned about with than the possibility that my numbers are off a little bit. It's that there are these boundary effects that you get into when a company's success gets to a certain scale, and you get into this sort of nonlinear zone, right? Where you can't make any assumptions beyond that point anymore. And I think that's where the model is most likely to break. It could break in that maybe self-driving just doesn't work. It could be from an information theory standpoint that there's something super fundamental that we're missing and the cars are just never going to be good. Like, I don't believe that, but I can't say there's zero possibility. I just think it's a really small case. Or I could say somebody else gets to market before it takes long enough, they run away with the market, or for some strategic reason, a meteor hits Tesla. There's things that happen, but the thing that I think is the most likely flaw in my model, right, when you do the napkin model, is just it's the law of big numbers, right? You get to a certain point and things break because the system isn't designed to deal with things on that scale.
Fascinating. Yeah, I definitely have a bunch of more questions, but we'll save that. Thank you, James, for spending half the day with me chatting about these topics, and definitely appreciate it.
These are effectively private conversations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've linked.
Sign up.
Yeah, I've linked to James Douma's Twitter account in the video description. I've linked to his playlist on my channel as well, where you can look at our past discussions and interviews. Hope it's been helpful for everyone, or anyone who's still listening to this conversation. But yeah, I think it's a joy. It's a pleasure not just talk with you, James, but also to just let people, be part of the conversation, having an open conversation, because whatever I'm learning, other people can learn. They have questions, they can ask you, ask me.
Some people will enjoy it.
Yeah, there's a community effort, and I think it's a great, definitely an interesting opportunity just to be part of. But thank you.